40 years ago, a stretch of degraded farmland in Niger was producing almost nothing. The rains had stopped coming reliably. The topsoil was blowing away, and the trees that once held everything together had been cut down so thoroughly that most people assumed they were gone for good. Then a young agronomist walked over to what he thought was a scrubby bush, looked more carefully at its base, and realized he was standing on a forest. It had never left. It was just waiting underground. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of the living stumps beneath Africa's disappearing soil and the ancient technique that is bringing millions of hectares back from the edge without planting a single tree. The numbers that frame this story are almost too large to hold in the mind. Africa is losing an estimated 3.9 million hectares of forest every single year. That is roughly the surface area of Switzerland disappearing from the map in 12 months. Tanzania alone is losing around 469,000 hectares of forest annually, according to national statistics. The Dodoma region in the country's interior sits near the sharp end of that figure, a semi-arid landscape where the climate is punishing, the soils are exhausted, and the conventional answer to deforestation, which is to plant new trees, has failed repeatedly and expensively. I want to sit with that failure for a moment because it matters to the rest of this story. Over the past 2 decades, billions of dollars have been channeled into tree planting programs across the dry lands of sub-Saharan Africa. Governments pledged millions of seedlings. International campaigns promised 1 trillion trees. The Pope planted a tree. And yet, in places like Dodoma, more than 80% of planted seedlings died before they ever became trees. The climate was too harsh, the projects too poorly managed, the funding too short-term, and the communities living on the land were rarely given the tools or the knowledge to keep the work going once the outside money ran out. The desert kept advancing. What I want to do now is take this story back to where the turning point actually happened, not in Tanzania, but in Niger on the opposite side of the continent, 40 years ago, because that is where a man named Tony Rinaudo made the discovery that changed everything. Rinaudo had moved to Niger in 1980 as a young agronomist, drawn by the ecological and humanitarian emergency unfolding across the Sahel. Desertification was accelerating. Drought was relentless. He did what every expert at the time was doing. He planted trees, and like every expert at the time, he watched most of them die. Nothing he tried worked in a way that was sustainable or economically viable for the communities he was trying to help. Then one afternoon, while driving a load of seedlings to a village, something stopped him. A bush at the roadside caught his eye. He climbed out and walked toward it, and when he crouched down and looked at the base, the whole picture shifted. The shape he was seeing was not a bush. It was a tree, a stump, still alive, pushing up new shoots from roots that had survived underground. In that moment, Rinaudo later said he understood that he had not been fighting the desert. He had been ignoring what was already there. What he had found was a native species, sometimes called the camel's foot, one of countless trees that once formed vast forests across these regions. The roots had outlasted everything, the clearing, the drought, the decades of degradation. The forest had not died. It had retreated below the surface and was holding its breath. This is the part of the story where I need to explain what actually happens when a tree is cut down and left in the ground, because it is not intuitive and it is not simple, and it is the key to everything that follows. When a tree grows normally, the dominant shoot at the top releases a hormone called auxin. That hormone suppresses the growth of the other shoots and buds further down, directing the tree's energy into one strong central trunk. When the tree is cut to a stump, auxin production stops. The root system, which can extend for meters in every direction and has spent years or decades accumulating energy, is suddenly without direction. So it does the only thing it can. It sends up dozens of new shoots at once. Those shoots compete with each other. None of them becomes dominant. The result looks exactly like a bush low, scraggly, apparently useless. And for generations, farmers and colonial administrators and development experts looked at those bushes and saw a wasteland. They were looking at forests. The fields and scrublands of the Sahel and stretching east across Tanzania, are underlaid by a vast and largely invisible network of living root systems. Underground forests, in the most literal sense, dormant, suppressed, but biologically intact and capable of response. Now, there is something I want to flag here, because this story carries a weight of history that is easy to understate. The reason so many of these root systems exist in a suppressed state today is not natural. It is the direct result of colonial land policy. When European powers drew new borders across Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they also redrew the relationship between people and land. Native trees were cleared for plantations, for cash crops, for charcoal and firewood to feed growing urban populations. Traditional land management practices, including the careful pruning and tending of trees within farmland that had been refined over generations, were dismissed as unscientific or unproductive and replaced with systems imported from somewhere else entirely. Even after independence, those unsustainable patterns persisted. The knowledge had been interrupted, the trees had been cut, but the roots had waited. This is where the concept of farmer managed natural regeneration enters the story, and where I want to bring in what has been happening specifically in Tanzania over the past 15 years. The technique itself is almost insultingly simple. You identify a living stump or root sprout that is putting up multiple shoots. You select the one or two strongest shoots, the ones most likely to grow into a healthy trunk, and you prune away the rest, redirecting the entire energy of that deep root system into a single, purposeful growth. That is it. No nursery, no irrigation, no imported seedling, no specialist equipment. A farmer with a basic pruning tool and the knowledge of what to look for can begin restoring a landscape in an afternoon. The speed of recovery is the thing that surprises almost everyone who encounters this for the first time, because you are not starting a tree from scratch. You are reactivating a root system that has been alive, sometimes for decades, accumulating water and nutrients below the surface. The shoot that follows a good pruning does not grow like a sapling. It grows like a tree that already has a foundation, because it does. In a landscape where a planted seedling might struggle for years before reaching any meaningful height, a managed regeneration shoot can become a genuine tree in a fraction of the time. And as those trees recover, the landscape around them begins to change. Their canopy shades the soil, reducing evaporation and cooling the surface temperature. Their roots physically anchor the soil against erosion. The moisture they transpire contributes to local humidity and, over time, to rainfall patterns. The land becomes more productive. Crops grow better. Livestock have shade and fodder. Communities that had been watching their livelihoods shrink begin to see them expand. The technique carries a Swahili name in Tanzania, Kisiki Hai. It means, literally, living stump. And there is something in that name worth pausing on. The word survived the clearing of the trees. Farmers in the Dodoma region had a name for the stumps that kept pushing up shoots, no matter how many times they were cut back. They had always known those stumps were alive. What had been lost was the knowledge of how to work with them rather than against them. The organization that has been carrying this knowledge back into communities across Tanzania is the LEAD Foundation, which has spent the past 15 years training farmers in Kisiki Hai and building local networks of expertise. According to the foundation's own records, the work has already transformed around 500,000 hectares of land in Tanzania. The model is straightforward. Identify farmers who are already practicing or curious about the technique, train them rigorously, and then deploy them as educators in their own communities, reaching households in even the most remote rural areas. The foundation is currently training new cohorts of what they call champion farmers, people who will spend the next 3 years working across the Dodoma region, reaching thousands of households and carrying the technique into villages that have never encountered it. A study published in Nature Sustainability found that farmer managed natural regeneration, applied at scale across the Sahel, had contributed to the restoration of approximately 5 million hectares in Niger alone over a period of 20 years, with measurable increases in crop yields, livestock resilience, and household food security. The researchers emphasized that the success of the approach depended almost entirely on farmer knowledge and farmer agency, not on external inputs. That finding matters. It is the thing that separates Kisiki Hai from the billion-dollar tree planting programs that failed. The knowledge lives with the people on the land, and it costs almost nothing to transfer. Across the broader Sahel and dryland regions where the technique has spread, estimates now suggest that as many as 18 million hectares have been restored through this approach. That figure is difficult to fully verify, and different sources give different numbers depending on methodology, but the order of magnitude is consistent across multiple assessments. This is not a boutique conservation project. This is one of the largest ecological restoration movements on Earth, and most people who care about the environment have never heard of it. But none of this was guaranteed. And I want to be honest about that, because the story of Kisiki Hai is not simply the story of a discovery followed by triumph. It is also the story of decades during which the discovery existed and the landscape continued to degrade because knowledge alone is not enough. The technique requires farmers to change how they manage their land. It requires them to see value in trees growing inside their fields rather than competing with their crops. That is a cultural and economic shift, not just a technical one. The Lead Foundation's approach, building from within communities, training local champions, connecting the work to tangible improvements in household income and food security is what allowed the technique to move from demonstration plots to a genuine national movement. The restoration happened because the human infrastructure was built carefully over years alongside the ecological work. There is a phrase I keep returning to when I think about what Kisiki Hai represents. We didn't restore the landscape. We returned the knowledge of what the landscape already contained, and we stepped back. The underground forest was always there. The roots were always alive. The trees were always waiting for someone to recognize a bush as something more and to make one cut in the right place. Tony Rinaudo made that cut in Niger in the early 1980s. Samuel Mnsanjila and the Lead Foundation have been making it across Tanzania for 15 years, and the land has responded in some cases faster than anyone expected. Shade returning to fields that had baked bare for a generation, soil that had been blowing away in the dry season held in place by roots that had never given up. Rain, some farmers report, coming more reliably to areas where the tree cover has recovered sufficiently to influence local moisture cycles. The question this story leaves me with is not whether the technique works. That is settled. The question is why it took so long for the rest of the world to pay attention to it. The answer, I suspect, has something to do with the fact that it does not look like progress. It does not involve a laboratory or a satellite or a $1 trillion pledge. It involves a farmer crouching next to a stump and making a decision. It is knowledge, not technology. It is presence, not investment. And we have spent a very long time underestimating both. If you want to go deeper into the patterns that make some ecological recoveries succeed where others fail, the cases that did not go to plan and what eventually saved them anyway, I have put together a resource called the Rewilding Complete Pack, which covers recoveries like this one in much greater detail than any single video can hold. You can find it at the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen right now. And here's what I want to tell you next. Because the story of Kisiki Hai leads somewhere that will change how you think about what restoration actually means. The communities in Dodoma are not restoring a landscape to some imagined historical baseline. They are rebuilding the conditions under which people can live well and sustainably on land that was handed to them in a degraded state. The trees coming back are not decorative. They are functional infrastructure for water, for soil, for food, for climate. They are the architecture of a livable future, growing up from roots that were there all along. There are more stories like this one than you would imagine, and I have many more to tell you. Stories of knowledge recovered at the last moment, of landscapes that looked dead but were only waiting, of communities that rebuilt what colonialism and poverty had stripped away, not with outside money and imported seedlings, but with their own hands and a technique that had survived, just barely, in memory. We did not restore the landscape. We returned the animal that knew how, and we stepped back. In this case, the animal was a farmer with a pruning tool and a name for what he was looking at. Kisiki Hai, the living stump, a word that outlived the trees and now gives them back their meaning. I'm Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.